I'm happy to be sitting on the stage today with Bari Weiss, who is an opinion writer and editor for the New York Times. Since joining the Times in 2017, Bari has, shall we say, made some waves in the world of letters and the internet with her writing and speaking. Vanity Fair recently called her the Times' star opinion writer and the provocateur that the left loves to hate. I think Bari would probably say that she fits neither comfortably on the left nor the right, and perhaps that is a statement about our times. Weiss first began writing columns long ago as a student at Columbia University, where she did activism around professors who were professing anti-Zionist points of view. She wrote and edited for Haaretz, for The Forward, The Wall Street Journal, and Tablet, and then joined the New York Times. Her work has focused directly on issues that are relevant to this group here today. She often writes defenses of Israel and also calls out anti-Semitism in all of its forms. She has a book coming out in September to be published by Crown called How to Fight Anti-Semitism. I first met Bari last October when we were both in Pittsburgh covering and writing about the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue. And I can say for me personally as a reporter, it was a moving experience to see the way that Jewish community came together for funerals, solidarity events, to support all of the people who were hurt in that shooting. And it was also really moving to me to know that that's the Jewish community that Bari came from. That told me something about who she is and how she writes today. So I'm very glad to welcome you here today, Bari. Thank you so much for joining me in conversation.
Thank you so much.
So I wanted to start by talking about that shooting in Pittsburgh, because this has just been such a transformative experience, I think, not only for Jews from Pittsburgh, but also Jews around the country. For you, being someone who came from Pittsburgh, who thinks about these issues, how did it feel to know that your community had been attacked in this violent way?
I want to say that any experience like that is shocking, and I think in a way I'm still in the shock of it. But I cannot say that I was entirely surprised. I think that, you know, there's several websites that track gun violence in this country. I think there's been something like 40 mass shootings in the last month alone. So it has to sort of be a failure of the imagination not to conceive of something like that happening in your community, which, you know, to me is a really scary testament to the kind of moment that we're in this country and the violence that's sort of become banal. But of course it's shocking in the sense of, you know, these were my neighbors. I was bat mitzvahed at Tree of Life. My dad, I think, knew 6 or 7 of the victims personally. If there was a positive thing, and I think there were several, but I think one of the really, really beautiful things to come out of the tragedy of that experience is that the world got to see what I already knew about my community. It is a community that, as Leah Leibowitz wrote in Tablet after Tablet, a bunch of reporters had come in for the week, and he wrote this beautiful piece called The Pittsburgh Principles, which is sort of a reflection of, the Pittsburgh platform and the reform movement. And he talked about the sort of communal arithmetic that we live by in Pittsburgh, and that is multiply instead of divide. That was very much the case in my family. We paid dues or half dues at 3 or 4 synagogues, a Reform, a Conservative, and Orthodox. It was very normal for me to go to my shul, which was egalitarian, progressive, read Torah, then go to lunch at Chabad, then go play basketball at the JCC. This is, I think, a really, really beautiful communal model, and one that I felt really lucky to be a part of. The other thing that I think came out of the experience that was really moving, is that if you looked at it on the surface, this was just another pogrom in the very, very long history of anti-Jewish pogroms. But if you looked a tiny bit closer, you see that it actually was quite different. You know, in Alexandria, Egypt, I think that's the first recorded pogrom in 38, or in, you know, we can name any number, in Eastern Europe or in Germany, Kristallnacht. What happened in those instances, where they were either sanctioned by the authorities joined in, or so did the neighbors surrounding it. The opposite happened in Pittsburgh. In Pittsburgh, you had Christian groups, Muslim groups, two of the Pittsburgh Steelers were pallbearers at the funeral where I saw you outside of Cecil and David Rosenthal. The Penguins, I mean, name your group, civic, political, religious. They stood up and understood intrinsically that supporting us was not a favor that they were bestowing upon the Jewish community, but in standing in solidarity, they were defending their own values. And I think that's what's really important to think about when we think about how to combat and fight anti-Semitism. It's not about beseeching other people to give us some kind of handout or favor. It's about, if you want to preserve America, if you want to preserve all of these things that has made this country so singular in history and so singular for the Jewish people, then you need to fight this scourge, because there's no greater sign of societal disintegration than the spread of anti-Semitism. And that is, I believe, what we're seeing right now.
Well, so this is the subject of your upcoming book. You're writing about not only this resurgence, but how to fight it. And I know this is going to be a complex question, but just briefly, how do you explain this surge that we're seeing in anti-Semitism in the United States and around the world?
Okay, longer conversation, obviously, but I'll give you the bullet points. Anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory. It is often talked about as if it is just another kind of hate or another kind of racism or just bigotry. But that's not what anti-Semitism is, right? Racism is about, you're black, you're lesser than me, I'm punching down. Anti-Semitism, the Jew is not lesser. The Jew is both lesser and better. The Jew is both capitalist and communist. The Jew is both, the controlling hand of the government. I mean, I can go on and on and on, and that's always sort of been the case. So in anti-Semitism, the Jew is a kind of stand-in for everything. And often it's a stand-in for the thing that the society despises the most, right? So that's why right now, on the far right, you have the sort of blood and soil ethno-nationalists claiming that the Jews are the ultimate betrayers of the white Christian nation, because many Jews pass as white, and yet they vote overwhelmingly for Democrats, they support progressive causes, they support immigration, and so the Jews are never white or Christian enough. And on the left, you have the opposite claim. On the far left, what we're seeing is the idea that the Jews are too white, they're too privileged, and therefore the anti-Semitism against them can never really count. And so we're getting sort of squeezed on both sides. I would say that one of the reasons that anti-Semitism is spreading is that when the center is not holding, when people are sort of running to those two extremes, it's historically borne out, and certainly we see it in this moment, a very, very bad situation for Jews, where we're sort of left politically homeless. We're left out of the traditional caste system of the far right, and we're certainly left out of the new caste system of the far left. And so that, I would say, is an important place to start. And then just to think about, in general, societies in which lies thrive, in which truth has become lost, are societies in which Jews are not going to do well. Societies in which freedom is not prospering. Jews, right? I mean, Dara Horn wrote this very, very important op-ed that I would recommend all of you look up after the Poway shooting. She's written several in the Times over the past year, but that one I really loved. And she talks about how Jews are sort of the symbol of freedom in a society, and we always have been. We're the symbol of difference. We are the symbol of worshiping differently, believing differently, bringing deeply radical iconoclastic ideas into the world, right? The idea of equality, the idea of human freedom, the idea that slavery is evil. These are deeply iconoclastic ideas, and the ability for us to believe in them over time, to the extent that we can, is the extent to which a society sort of is tolerating of difference. When societies that don't tolerate difference, that don't tolerate the freedom, are societies where Jews are not going to do very well.
Do you think President Donald Trump has enabled anti-Semitism in the United States?
I do. Look, none of us know what's in Donald Trump's heart. I don't know what's in yours. I think really good things, but none of us know. But I do think that what Donald Trump has done is that he's a conspiracy thinker. It's almost like, someone that indulges in conspiracy-minded thinking. I'm thinking of obvious ones like birtherism, but then even smaller, more insidious ones, right? Like the idea that Judge Curiel couldn't judge a case because he's a Mexican, never mind that he was born in Indiana. I mean, we can go down the list of the kind of lies that this president has propagated. And as I just said before, a society in which conspiracy thinking and lies are on the rise opens the door to the ultimate conspiracy theory, which is anti-Semitism. Donald Trump, you know, there are various things that people pick up on, the dog whistles, you know, the recent one that just came out in the Michael Wolff book, take that with a grain of salt, about, you know, how the Jews always fold. There's all these dog whistles, right? And that's what people pick up on. But that is sort of eliding the bigger thing, which is that he's a defiler of societal norms. And when that kind of defiling happens, when you have someone who's the commander-in-chief of the strongest army in the world, who doesn't tell the truth on a consistent basis, that's the thing to really be worried about. And I don't think it is a coincidence that people like David Duke and Richard Spencer were drawn to Trump's banner.
You've also spent a lot of time calling out anti-Semitism on the left, and this is everything from the leaders of the Women's March to people like Representative Ilhan Omar, who has been called out a number of times this spring for making comments that overtly or indirectly referenced anti-Semitism or played on anti-Semitic tropes. Do you think that the left is really as dangerous to Jews as men in Charlottesville with tiki torches shouting, "Jews will not replace us"?
I think they're differently threatening. The person that's going to come into your synagogue with a gun, God forbid that is going to happen, that person is very, very likely to be a white supremacist. We all know that that's true. And that kind of anti-Semitism is very easy to understand because it is extremely blunt. The person comes in and says, "Kill all the Jews," as they have throughout history. I think one of the reasons that I've tried to write a lot about anti-Semitism on the left is because I believe that it is much, much harder to see for a lot of people, because it often comes cloaked in the language that is familiar to our own tongues, the language that we want to identify with, the language of anti-racism, of social justice, of all these things that sound really good. And, you know, but when social justice comes in the form of believing that only one state in the world does not deserve a right to exist, then you have to sort of wonder what kind of justice that really is. So I think anti-Semitism on the far right is certainly, at least right now, much more physically violent. I don't think there's a question about that. But the anti-Semitism on the far left is very, very insidious. And we only need to look right across the pond, you know, in England, to see what can happen, and very, very quickly when it's mainstreamed. I'm really distressed by the way that the Democratic Party has sort of not censured people like Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar for the things that they've said. I think it's a really, really bad sign about where things could be headed. I also think, look, it's very easy to call out someone like Steve King. It's very, very hard to call out someone like Ilhan Omar, and for real reasons, right? This is someone who is a woman of color. She wears a hijab. She has this really incredible, inspiring story of being a refugee from Somalia. Who wouldn't want to support someone with that sort of profile, and B, she's subject, because of those parts of her identity, to a lot of hate and vitriol. So I think when we criticize someone like her, it's very, very important to criticize her based on her ideas and not based on her identity. And I think that that's sort of a very important thing to follow in general when we're talking about this.
Yeah, you know, one of the complicated parts of criticizing someone like Representative Omar on her ideas, and I hear this all the time in my reporting, the sense that people who sit in these different seats hear differently comments that are coming from someone like Representative Omar, Representative Tlaib. They don't hear the kind of dog whistles that some Jews hear when they speak. They don't see these things as trope. They see them as a way of policing their words or trying to crack down on them because of who they are. So how do you, as a writer, as someone who's a member of different communities, try to navigate that? This idea that when you hear anti-Semitism, other people hear nothing at all.
That's a really good question. I have to say, so I wrote one of the first, I think the first big column about Ilhan Omar in the Times, and she responded to it publicly. I invited her to come into the New York Times to talk about her ideas on Twitter. She's very much still welcome. I'd love to host her. But I think I sort of a little bit made a mistake in that column where I framed what she had said, and I don't think this was wrong, but I think it was limited, in terms of the tropes she had used. And tropes since then has sort of become a meme, you know, someone using anti-Semitic tropes. Tropes are bad. What's worse is the substance of an idea. If you believe in BDS, if you believe, and you know, there's a lot of misreporting about what BDS is really about, right? People, you know, including in many newspapers, try and frame BDS as being about fighting for Palestinian rights. That is not true. You can support Palestinian rights, and that is excellent, and I do, but BDS is about the elimination of the Jewish state. BDS is about fighting for a reality in which, to put it in just the most generous terms, there's a binational state. And anyone who knows anything about the politics and the history of minorities in the Middle East can imagine what that binational state might look like. It would be unbelievable amounts of bloodshed and maybe genocide of the Jewish people. That's just what that would look like. So I think that I made a mistake a little bit in framing it in terms of the language she used. The language was bad. All About the Benjamins is bad. It suggests dual loyalty. It suggests this idea that there's a secret Jewish hand behind, I mean, you all know in this room. But the deeper problem, right, is that we have representatives in government who are unapologetically supporting a movement that believes in eliminating one state of all of the states in the world. That's the thing that I think we need to be focusing on, even more than the specific language that's used, maybe.
Something else that I know you've been grappling with in recent months is some problems at home. In the New York Times, the accusations around...
My parents getting divorced.
Barry, I've got news. Sorry.
They're great. They're doing great.
Everything's great in the Weiss household, don't worry. At the New York Times, you know, we had the revelation of this cartoon that was published in the international edition of the New York Times.
Wait, what cartoon?
What cartoon? You have really been working on that book. I am impressed.
Yeah, that was something I could not miss. Yeah.
So, you know, all of you have probably seen it, this image of Donald Trump being led around by Benjamin Netanyahu, this idea of the Jew who's sort of perniciously leading along the unwitting non-Jew by the collar. And there were a lot of people who saw this and thought, this isn't just dog whistle level anti-Semitism. This is like out and out, like Der Stürmer anti-Semitism.
Yes.
So what has it been like for you to be at the New York Times, to be wrestling with this moment? What has the internal conversation been like?
Well, I was on book leave when the cartoon was published, but I would really recommend, for those who haven't read it, although looking at this room, I bet you have, Bret Stephens had an excellent column that really summed up my views of the thing. Just the takeaway, right, is if anti-Zionism becomes a normative political view, this is what follows. Right? So it's one thing to believe in a college seminar where you're talking about anarchism or abolishing the nation state. Okay, there you can have a conversation about, like, should nation states exist? Oh, was this a good idea? Should there have been partition in India, Pakistan? It's an intellectual discussion. But in the world, and what we're seeing increasingly on the progressive left, and I think that that's very much reflected in all sorts of liberal institutions, including the New York Times, is the normalization of anti-Zionism as a normative political belief. And when that happens, things like that cartoon follow very, very naturally, which is why I think it's very important to expose anti-Zionism for what it is. What's it like being a Jew at the New York Times? This is like the #1 question I always get. It's given me an unbelievable platform. You know, I was at the Wall Street Journal for many years. It was great in many ways. I, you know, left along with many people from the editorial page over where the paper was going on Trump, where the editorial page was going. So I basically went from being the most left-wing person at the Wall Street Journal's conservative editorial page to like a fascist at the New York Times. So that's my life. Send my therapist bills to this room. So it's uncomfortable, but in a lot of ways, I see it as my experience as being sort of typifying the Jewish experience of the moment. And I think it's very, very important, as uncomfortable as it is to be politically homeless, to maintain our liberalism in this moment. And when I say liberalism, I mean that broadly defined. I don't mean Republican, Democrat. I mean holding on to the ideals that have made this country so, so special. And frankly, it's not a coincidence that this country has been so good to the Jews. You know, Lincoln called America, I think this is so beautiful, he called America the almost chosen nation. Why is it the almost chosen nation? Because he, like so many of our other founders, believed that the Jews were the chosen nation. They didn't see the state as replacing the Jews, as so many people in Europe did. What they saw is deep inspiration in this story, right? There was a whole debate about what should go on the seal of the country, and various people suggested that it should be, you know, Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt and through the Red Sea. So I think that, you know, going back to first principles and thinking about what are the ideals with all of its flaws that this country is based on, how do they connect with Jewish ideas, and how can we fight for those? That's a really, really, I think, important and good place to be. And I think if we follow that as our kind of North Star, we won't be misled.
Well, that's where we have to stop. Thank you all so much for joining me with Bari.